The Inflation Reduction Act is shaking up Medicare Part D. Here's what you must know about 2025 drug costs. Welcome back to Medicare Happy Hour, the most fun you'll have on the internet while talking about Medicare. If you like this, please feel free to give us a thumbs up and subscribe. Today, I am sipping on a screwdriver, and let's go ahead and dive into 2025 Medicare Part D costs. All right, so cheers. Let's go ahead and dive into Part D drug costs in 2025. All right, so first things first that we need to go ahead and cover is how to get Medicare Part D. So as a reminder, Medicare Part D is a standalone drug plan that you purchase that pairs either with original Medicare, your red, white, and blue Medicare card, or your Medicare supplement. Now, you cannot purchase a standalone Part D drug plan to go with a Medicare Advantage plan because these are typically included with the Medicare Advantage plan. So essentially, if you have a Medicare Advantage plan with the Part D in it, you're not going to get an additional drug plan. In fact, if you have a Medicare Advantage plan that doesn't include a Part D drug plan, you can't even purchase one to go with it. So if you need the drugs, make sure you're getting a Medicare Advantage plan that includes the Part D drugs. So the one thing is important to note here is for those individuals that don't take drugs and think, well, I don't take anything, why would I want to get a prescription drug plan? There are penalties for not enrolling in a Part D drug plan. And if eventually you do want to enroll in a Part D drug plan, you will pay a penalty for every single month that you were not on one. So there are a lot of lower cost Part D drug plans that I would recommend maybe considering picking up just to go ahead and avoid that penalty. But that's something we could talk about another day. So what's going on here with the Part D drugs? So the Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed in 2022, it essentially eliminated the donut hole. And with the Affordable Care Act, the donut hole had really been reduced every year since 2010. So the amount that individuals were spending inside of this donut hole was much, much less than it was in the past. But still, what I'm going to talk about today has saved a lot of people and will continue to save a lot of people a lot of money. So essentially what it established was there was never any maximum out of pocket for Part D drugs. You know, what this said is that the most an individual will spend out of pocket is $2,000 a year total for their covered prescription drugs. Now, it's important to remember the covered, and we'll talk about formularies and tiers and things like that because it is critical that you make sure that your prescriptions are covered by the plan that you're on or none of this applies to you. So essentially, the other thing here is this Inflation Reduction Act established an option to pay your out-of-pocket Part D costs in a monthly amount over the whole year. Essentially what this is it's called smoothing. And you'd go to your pharmacy the first time for the year, and if you had a large amount that you were going to be spending, they would take that amount and divide it out over the 12 months, or essentially smooth out your cost and what you would spend for every month for the year. So I just mentioned formularies, and I think maybe I've mentioned even tiers. So let me go ahead and explain what those are. Essentially, first things first, a formulary is the list of a Medicare Part D or Medicare Advantage plan, a list of the drugs that are covered by that plan. Every single plan has a different list. This is important to keep in mind. Essentially, what the government says is you have to cover a certain number of drugs in every therapeutic category, but it doesn't tell you which drugs you have to cover. So let's say maybe you have to cover 4 blood pressure medicines and there's 9 out there. You know, if you're on one of those 5 that plan does not cover, you're either going to need to switch your plan or switch your drugs. I would imagine most people would prefer to switch their plan, but it's ultimately your choice. So kind of what is this? Essentially what it means is the tiers are 1, 2, 3, they're specialty tiers. They're all handled a little different, but generally the lower the tier, the less expensive the drug. So for example, tier 1 would be a low cost. A lot of these are even zero copay. And they are generally your generics. The second tier, these are more expensive, your preferred brand names. Third tier, even more expensive, non-preferred brand names. And the last would be specialty drugs. And these really are where a lot of people start to spend a lot of money on their prescriptions. I know everyone's heard about the Alzheimer's drug, and that's an infusion, so it's handled a little differently, but you start to see how these specialty drugs can be quite so expensive. We've seen people over the years spend $10,000, $20,000 a year on their prescriptions. So obviously this $2,000 max out of pocket is going to change a lot of people's lives. So, not every insurance company is this cut and dry. Some of them might have 5 tiers, some of them might have preferred generics, etc. But in general, this is the structure and the way that that the Part D drug plans are generally created. All right, so I referenced the donut hole earlier, and what I want to do now is just walk you through the coverage phases for 2025, because like I mentioned earlier, with that 2,000 max out of pocket, this has really changed significantly. It had changed significantly regardless over the last 15 years, but really it's changed a lot for 2025. So first things first, the deductible phase. So the way this works is many people pay 100% of their prescription drug costs until they hit their annual deductible. In 2025, that annual deductible is $590. Now, something I do want to mention here, this is the standard that the government puts together. A lot of plans have chosen to enhance this standard. So each plan at least has to be this good. There are a lot of plans out there, though, that waive a portion of this deductible or will cover things like generics inside of the deductible. So not necessarily does everyone see that $590 deductible, but it is part of the general structure. So plans can only enhance, they cannot be worse than this. So important thing to note as we move forward. So again, the deductible phase in 2025, $590. After the cost of your drugs surpass $590, you would enter what's known as the initial coverage phase. So essentially, this is where things start to get a little complicated with the Inflation Reduction Act. Essentially what happens here is you're going to pay around 25% of the cost of your drugs until the total cost of your drugs hits $2,000. Now, I'll be frank with you. This is new this year, and we are still assessing this and trying to figure out how the government and the insurance companies are mathematically coming up with this $2,000. The vast majority that I have seen of examples of people that come in that maybe last year spent $4,000 or $5,000 on drugs, they are still not seeing the total cost of their prescriptions get anywhere near this $2,000. So really at the end of the day, I can't give you a concrete number, whether it's going to be this 25%, but I can tell you it will not be over $2,000. So that's a real big positive for a lot of these people, because a lot of them came in and met with us for next year and thought, all right, well, at least I know I'm only spending $2,000 versus the $4,000 or $5,000 I spent last year. And then they left here pleasantly surprised that they were actually going to be spending even less than the $2,000. So just like the deductible, keep in mind the $2,000 number and know that that's essentially worst case scenario when it comes to prescriptions for you now. And then the last one here is the catastrophic coverage phase. So there's no cost sharing for covered drugs. Essentially, this is what kicks in once you hit that $2,000 max out of pocket. So then you will not be responsible for any of this. So, this really has changed a lot of people's situation when it comes to prescriptions, because they're generally the most expensive element of healthcare for individuals over 65. The $2,000 obviously does not include the plan premium if you're on a Part D standalone drug plan, but again, $2,000 is that max out of pocket that you'll be spending on copays for your prescriptions. All right, to kind of put a bow on Part D drug costs in 2025, a few things I want you to take away from this video is, the Part D premiums versus the out-of-pocket costs. I just mentioned this. The premium is what you pay to access the plan. So that's what you're going to pay directly to the insurance company for the plan. Whereas the out-of-pocket costs, those copays, you're paying at the pharmacy or the mail order or however you actually procure your drugs. It's important to know the difference between those, because the $2,000 is only the cost that you're spending on your drugs. It's not that premium. So you can kind of see here, but it's important. You must pay your plan premium no matter which phase you're in, and to access the drugs, you really frankly have to pay that. So, what should you do as a recap as we move forward? At the end of the day, you should review your Medicare Advantage or your standalone Part D drug plan, because these formularies that I mentioned earlier, that changes every single year. And I think we're going to continue to see more and more changes for the formularies as we still adjust to this $2,000 out of pocket, and as these drug plans really get rolling. The government instituted a few changes for this year that we'll see if they continue for the next year to continue to cap expenses and whatnot. So the $2,000 is here to stay, but it's important that you're aware of all of this information. Likewise, the Part D penalties that I talked about earlier, that's a major concern for a lot of people if they, weren't taking drugs and chose not to get a Part D drug plan initially. When they do choose to get one, it's going to be more expensive. You can go ahead and learn more about the Part D penalties by clicking here. We have additional videos on that. And likewise, one thing I did want to mention is I was just talking about that $2,000 out of pocket and that 25% and how, frankly, the math doesn't really add up necessarily correctly. And we're seeing it that most people are spending less than the 25% and less than the 2,000. So if any of you have been surprised by that, go ahead and leave us a comment below and let us know, what are you paying versus what did you think you were paying? Because it's always really interesting to see when you get to the pharmacy, what do things actually cost? And at the end of the day, our expert advisors at RetireMed are here to help you. Give us a call, shoot us a note. We're here to help.